A new beginning. Maria Alvarez pressed her forehead to the cool glass window as their family minivan coasted through winding roads lined with sycamore trees, sunlight casting dappled patterns over the pristine lawns and grand driveways. For a moment, the homes seemed almost unreal. Three-car garages, basketball hoops gleaming in the afternoon light, manicured flower beds exploding with color. Her husband, Javier, hummed along to the soft music on the radio while their two children, Sofia, age 7, and little Mateo, just 4, peered wide-eyed at their new neighborhood. This was nothing like the crowded apartment in East Los Angeles. Here, in this affluent corner of suburban America, everything appeared orderly, safe, and slightly intimidating. The realtor's brochure had called Maplewood Estates a close-knit community of successful families, promising excellent schools, well-equipped playgrounds, and safety at every street corner. Still, Maria couldn't shake the ripple of anxiety in her chest. She asked herself whether she truly belonged here. A sense of excitement mingled with trepidation as they pulled up to their new home, a 2-story house painted a cheerful eggshell blue. Javier parked, and Sofia shrieked with delight when she spotted the swing set in the backyard. Maria stepped out, inhaling a breath of crisp, clean air. The neighborhood was serenely quiet. The only sounds were children's laughter in the distance and the faint hum of a gardener's lawnmower. As the moving truck arrived, Maria got to work directing the movers, carefully checking off boxes on her list. While Javier handled the paperwork inside, Maria unpacked the kitchen essentials, arranging her familiar spices and battered cookware on the granite countertops, hoping they would ground her in this unfamiliar place. It wasn't long before the first of the neighbors approached. Brenda, a tall woman in smart athleisure, her hair pulled into a tight ponytail. She waved as if performing for an unseen audience, offering a bright, practiced smile. "Welcome to Maplewood Estates." Just behind Brenda stood Jessica and Caroline, one holding a tray of cookies that looked professionally made, the other pressing her designer purse protectively to her side. Their greetings were polite but distant, their glances drifting past Maria as if she were part of the landscaping. The conversation revolved around neighborhood rules, the homeowners association, and the upcoming block party. Maria smiled, nodded, and tried to follow their rapid-fire English, feeling the weight of their scrutiny at every pause. Brenda asked where Maria's family was from. When Maria proudly answered, "Los Angeles, but originally Mexico," Brenda's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, how exotic," she responded, before swiftly changing the subject to piano lessons and private tennis coaches. Over the next few days, Maria ventured out with Sofia and Mateo, visiting the park and supermarket, sending polite waves and hellos to neighbors she passed. Often, her greetings were ignored, or worse, met with cool, dismissive glances. At the playground, she overheard women chatting in circles, speaking in hushed voices that lowered further when she walked by. The sense of exclusion was palpable. At home, Maria tried to project her optimism for the children, unpacking their toys, helping them pick out clothes for their new school, even baking pan dulce to fill the kitchen with familiar, comforting aromas. Yet every night when the house grew quiet, she wondered how long it would take to break through the invisible walls these other women seemed to build around themselves. She scribbled her thoughts into a beat-up notebook, jotting down names, overheard phrases, and the peculiar rituals of the Maplewood moms. On the third evening, a formal invitation slid under their door, a pastel card embossed with gold lettering, inviting the Alvarezes to the monthly ladies' coffee social. Maria's heart fluttered between hope and dread. Maybe, she thought, this could be her chance to truly belong. But as she gazed around at her new home, boxes half unpacked, family photographs waiting to be hung, Maria wondered if acceptance here came with a price she wasn't sure she wanted to pay. The chapter closes with Maria standing at her front window, looking out at her well-tended street and the endless possibilities and challenges that awaited her and her family in this new world. The rumor mill. Maria's first week in Maplewood Estates turned from new beginning jitters to a creeping, persistent discomfort. The streets remained pristine and the lawns perfectly trimmed, but beneath the suburb's glossy surface, she could sense the currents of judgment flowing all around her. It began with glances, a sideways look from a neighbor walking an impeccably groomed dog, or a barely there smile from a woman bundled in high-end workout gear on her morning jog. The greetings she offered, always cheerful and polite, floated in the air unanswered, dissolving before they ever found a landing place. The first real sign that she was being talked about came at the local playground. Maria sat on a bench watching Sophia push Mateo on the swing. Nearby, a cluster of mothers, Brenda, Jessica, Caroline, and a few others she didn't know by name, huddled together. Their conversations a flurry of low, rapid words and muffled giggles. Whenever Maria glanced over, the murmuring shifted, and the women's eyes darted away as if she'd caught them mid-sentence. Later that day, as she walked past their group while helping the children out of the sandbox, she caught a snippet. "She probably doesn't even have a green card," followed by hushed laughter and a pointed look in Maria's direction. Her face flushed hot with humiliation, but she kept her head held high, trying not to let their words show on her face. Word traveled fast. In Maplewood Estates, especially when it came to newcomers who didn't quite fit the mold. Comments began to reach Maria through other neighbors, masquerading as small talk. "Did you know Brenda said your husband's car looks like it belongs in a different zip code? Are those really your kids? They look so tan. I heard you moved from somewhere dangerous." Even the smallest details, what Maria wore, how she styled her hair, the homemade empanadas she sent in Sophia's lunchbox, became fodder for speculation. At church on Sunday, an older woman approached her to ask, in front of several others, if she would help serve as a translator for the new immigrants who might one day join the congregation. The implication was clear. No matter how polite the invitation, Maria did not actually belong. Javier, careful not to dampen his wife's optimism, listened sympathetically but encouraged her to dismiss the whispers. "Give them time, cariño," he said gently one evening. "People in places like this, they just need to get to know you." But Maria suspected the problem was that they'd already decided who she was before a single conversation. The worst moments, however, always came at the hands of the Maplewood moms. At the next Homeowners Association meeting, Maria brought homemade cookies, a gesture she hoped would help her fit in. As soon as she placed the plate beside the store-bought goods, she overheard Caroline remark, "At least Jessica's aren't filled with whatever that spice is." Someone snickered. Maria wasn't sure if they thought she couldn't hear them or if they simply didn't care. The whispers about her simple clothing, her strong accent, her old-fashioned manners grew bolder with each passing week. When Brenda hosted a backyard brunch, Maria's invitation came as an afterthought, scribbled on a sticky note, delivered by a child who could barely pronounce her name. At the event, she spent most of her time sitting alone, watching the other women swap stories about Pilates instructors and designer handbags, her attempts to join in greeted with thinly veiled condescension. She noticed the subtle but sharp exclusion of her daughter, too. Sophia, once outgoing and eager, was now hesitant to approach the circle of girls at the park. Her smiles unanswered, her efforts to join in ignored. Maria's heart ached to see this rejection mirrored in her child. The most cutting slight came in the form of a joke made at the school pickup line. Brenda, in her signature bright workout outfit, leaned into another mom's car window and said loud enough for Maria to hear, "Isn't it brave, moving somewhere you can't even pronounce the street names?" The explanation was that she was just kidding, but the damage was done. Night after night, Maria recorded the details in her battered notebook, snatches of conversations, cruel jokes, names and faces attached to each slight. A pattern emerged. Exclusivity, derision, a hierarchy built on maintaining appearances and keeping anyone different on the outside. She felt herself shrinking, trying not to stand out, yet resenting every moment she spent fading into the background. Despite Javier's reassurances, Maria could not escape the ever-tightening ring of rumor and condescension. The Maplewood moms had built an invisible barrier around their perfect little world, and she was not welcome inside. But as she closed her notebook one particularly lonely evening, she promised herself she would not let them define her story. Not for long. The mask of aristocracy. Long before Maria arrived in Maplewood Estates, the neighborhood's queen bees controlled more than just the social calendar. They controlled the narrative. Over the next several weeks, Maria found herself not only on the outside looking in, but also acutely aware of the intricate theater playing out behind manicured hedges and pastel front doors. On quiet afternoons, when Mateo napped and Sophia played quietly with her dolls, Maria watched the neighborhood from behind her sheer kitchen curtains. She noticed how Brenda made her power felt without ever raising her voice, organizing charity brunches and yoga marathons, always with an air of benevolence that barely masked her need to be at the center of attention. Gossip clung to her like expensive perfume. Her words could raise a neighbor's profile or ruin it, depending on the mood and the company. What few people saw was the way Brenda's gaze darted toward her phone when it vibrated. A nervous flicker. A message she always seemed to read in secret. Her brow furrowing for just a moment. Jessica was always perfectly put together. Her nails a rotating palette of designer pastels. Her Instagram updated hourly. She organized shopping trips, wind-downs, and themed potlucks, her home a shrine to the latest trends in interior design. Outwardly, Jessica radiated contentment, boasting about flash sales and exclusive boutiques. Yet Maria couldn't forget the scene she had glimpsed one morning. Jessica standing in her driveway, her face twisted in panic as she rummaged through a stack of new delivery boxes, tearing at the tape with shaking hands. Later, Jessica's husband's tight, whispered complaints about another credit card bill drifted across the lawn, fading as quickly as they'd appeared. Caroline, in contrast, was the neighborhood's enigma. Her smile was always bright, her laughter a practiced melody at every gathering, and her stories about family adventures polished to a gleaming perfection. But Maria, attentive and invisible as she went about her day, recognized subtle signs. Caroline often lingered on the phone in her car, eyes glistening with unspoken pain. A wedding ring absent during weekday mornings. A sadness in her voice when speaking to her son after school. Rumor had it that Caroline's marriage was on the rocks, but she maintained the illusion of marital bliss for the benefit of all. As days blurred into weeks, Maria became a master observer. She could read the signals in each carefully curated social exchange, the forced friendship, the performative concern, the quick change of subject when uncomfortable truths threatened to break the suburban spell. She detected tremors behind the facade, a hastily wiped tear, a hurried explanation, a forced laugh that died quickly. She began scribbling notes in her battered notebook, forming a kind of diary that detailed the odd rituals and secret sorrows of Maplewood's leading ladies. Sometimes she wrote only a word: brunch, handbag, affair. But over time, her observations formed complex character sketches. Who comforted whom after a tiff with a husband? Whose child's grades were faltering despite the boasts at the school board? Who poured an extra glass of wine after the others had left? Maria realized that the elaborate rituals of the Maplewood moms were not so much about togetherness as about self-preservation. Their private wounds were hidden under layers of designer fabrics and carefully orchestrated routines. They wore their perfection like armor to ward off judgment from each other and from themselves. Yet what struck Maria most was the way these women kept up their performances, sometimes even deceiving themselves. Behind the potlucks, Pilates classes, and birthday extravaganzas. There was deep loneliness, a craving for validation, the fear of losing status, the exhaustion of keeping secrets. The more Maria watched, the more she empathized, even as their casual cruelty wounded her. It occurred to her one evening, after she watched Brenda slam her phone down in fury. Jessica's cheerful tone cracked during a Zoom party, and Caroline trudged home alone in the rain. That Maplewood Estates was a theater, and every woman wore a mask so convincing even her closest friends believed it to be her true face. But Maria, the outsider nobody bothered to include, saw through the make-believe. She gathered her findings, her sympathy, and her resentment growing in equal measure. In her private world of ink and paper, Maria began to wonder, what would happen if someone peeled off those masks? What if the truth of Maplewood, in all its messiness and imperfection, were laid bare for everyone to see? By the end of the chapter, Maria's notebook bulged with secrets, some small and petty, others heartbreaking and profound. The seeds of an idea began to sprout. Perhaps, for once, the outsider could be the storyteller, the one who holds up a mirror to this world of perfect lawns and imperfect lives. The birth of Queen Bee Watch. It started as a whisper, an idea that tiptoed into Maria's thoughts late at night, after the lights were out and even the humming of distant cars had faded into silence. At first, she brushed it aside. She had never thought of herself as the confrontational type, let alone a writer. But over the weeks of observation and quiet pain, the seeds of something rebellious and transformative began to dig roots inside her. She was tired of hearing the other women's stories told only in their voices, tired of being made invisible, misunderstood, and dismissed. If she couldn't fit herself into the picture-perfect frame that Maplewood required, perhaps she could build her own corner of truth. Perhaps she could hold up a mirror and let the surface finally crack. One chilly Thursday evening, after Javier had fallen asleep on the sofa and the children were tucked in, Maria found herself scrolling aimlessly on her phone at the kitchen table. She pulled out her battered blue notebook, now thick with scribbled observations, overheard confessions, and character sketches so vivid she could almost hear them breathe. On a sudden impulse, Maria navigated to a free blogging platform and stared at the blinking cursor in the empty "Choose a Title" field. Her first instinct was to choose something safe, generic, Notes from Maplewood, or Suburban Reflections. But her pulse quickened as she remembered the barbed, honeyed smiles of the women who policed the boundaries of belonging and exclusion. Brenda's expertly veiled digs, Jessica's helpful suggestions, Caroline's performative friendliness, all fell under the reign of a kind of suburban royalty. And so, almost without thinking, her fingers danced out the words. She choked back a laugh at her own boldness. It fit perfectly, a nod to the alpha mothers and their loyal hive, all sweetness on the surface and venom hidden beneath the honeycomb. She spent hours designing the blog's appearance, picking a crisp white background offset by honey-yellow accents and elegant, playful fonts. She uploaded a header image, an anonymous cartoon bee wearing a tiny golden crown. For the author name, she typed simply. Her hands trembled as she wrote the first post. It wasn't a rant, nor a cruel exposure of dirty laundry. Instead, it was a satirical scene, a vignette set at a Maplewood brunch in which Mrs. B presided, juggling neighborhood updates and dietary discussions with all the poise of a minor royal, her smile as sharp as her Pilates instructor's abs. She disguised real names, changing physical details and blurring family circumstances just enough to keep things technically anonymous. Still, anyone from Maplewood would recognize the cast instantly. The story described the ritual of one-upmanship that played out over avocado toast and sparkling water, who brought the most impressive dessert, whose child's science project was totally original, who was debuting a new bag from a boutique in Milan, you wouldn't know it. But as Maria wove her words, she injected subtle empathy, hints at the stress that radiated from beneath each perfect blowout, the way Mrs. J checked her phone with trembling hands, or how C sipped her mimosa a little too quickly when talk turned to marriage. Before publishing, Maria hesitated, her finger hovering over the post button. She reread every line, making sure there was nothing truly cruel. Just truth wrapped in velvet irony, neither vindictive nor vengeful, but sharp enough to prick the surface. Taking a deep breath, she clicked Publish. The entry gathered a handful of anonymous views overnight. Nothing noteworthy. But she wrote again the next evening, then a third time that week, each time sharpening her style and finding her satirical voice. She chronicled events in the neighborhood. A moonlit yoga sisterhood, so exclusive neighbors joked you needed a retina scan to attend. The latest bake sale that devolved into a passive-aggressive bake-off. A fashionable driveway soiree by Queen Bee, where the conversation buzzed with thinly veiled judgments and the laughter clinked like ice in Aperol spritzes. Maria found herself almost gleeful as she transformed the pain of exclusion into sly humor. Writing felt cathartic, a secret world where she could finally speak, unfiltered and free. The reader count began to climb. Comments appeared, anonymous, sometimes amused, sometimes fraught with speculation. Who is this genius? You nailed Mrs. J's lemon bars. Others chiming in with their own observations from the sidelines. But Maria was careful. She never wrote maliciously about the children or shared private tragedies. Any real secrets she'd uncovered stayed between her and the pages of her notebook. Her goal wasn't to destroy her neighbors, but to puncture the fantasy that this world was flawless and unassailable. Within a week, Queen Bee Watch became a minor sensation within the neighborhood's private Facebook group. Screenshots circulated via group texts. The mere mention of the blog at the local playground triggered nervous laughter, then indignant rants. Who would do such a thing? Had someone infiltrated their circle, taking notes while pretending to fit in? Maria watched the ripple effect with a mixture of guilt and vindication. If Brenda's clique was shaken, it only proved that their power depended on the secrecy and uniformity they fostered. She noticed a new brittleness to Brenda's smile, a new wariness in Jessica's live videos. Caroline, meanwhile, seemed introspective, almost haunted, as if she recognized herself in one of Maria's passages. Still, Maria's own life continued unchanged on the surface. Each morning, she packed Sophia's lunch, walked Mateo to preschool, washed laundry, and clipped coupons. But she walked with a new lightness, a spark in her chest no one could see. In the evenings, she drafted posts with a glass of orange juice at her elbow, her mind dancing with metaphors, her sentences sharp and alive. The secret weighed on her, both thrilling and terrifying. She deleted search histories, double-checked that her VPN was working, and whispered silent prayers that her IP address would stay as invisible as her presence at the Maplewood Moms brunch. She thought of telling Javier, but hesitated, protecting him from complications he couldn't foresee. Besides, this was her own rebellion, her voice finally taking shape. As days became weeks, the blog began to attract attention from outside Maplewood. A few parenting forums picked up links. Someone on X, the new incarnation of Twitter, posted a quote. "Queen Bee, Queen Drama, suburban secrets are always sweeter behind a smile." Comments flowed in from readers who admitted to living in their own closed-off communities, some cheering the writer's courage, others accusing her of stirring division, but all riveted. Maria read every comment, her heart pounding with each new notification. For the first time since moving to Maplewood, she felt seen, not as a stereotype or an outsider, but as a creator, a chronicler, a force to be reckoned with. And yet, beneath the secret satisfaction, she knew she was playing with fire. Sooner or later, someone in the hive would get stung. For now, Maria cherished each new evening with her laptop open, the gentle buzz of anonymity her only company. The sorrows of exclusion no longer merely endured, but transformed. Daylight hurts spun into midnight wit, and in her hidden corner of the internet, a new queen bee was learning to spread her wings. The ripple effect and alarm. At first, the buzz about Queen Bee Watch fluttered quietly through the virtual corridors of Maplewood Estates. An anonymous post here, a sly mention there, questions whispered with uncertain smiles at school drop-off and during early morning Pilates classes. But within days, the blog became a wildfire, uncontainable, crackling at the edges of every conversation, setting old routines smoldering with suspicion and unease. On Monday morning, Brenda's group met for their usual coffee at the Reserve Cafe, a glass-walled spot overlooking the artificial lake and crowned with glossy photos of the neighborhood's founders. This routine gathering, once an exercise in breezy, predictable small talk, had morphed into a tribunal. Jessica thrust her phone onto the table, the blog loaded and ready. "Look," she hissed, stabbing at a satirical vignette that painted a certain queen of brunch with a honeyed tongue and a black belt in silent judgment. Brenda's jaw tightened. "That's supposed to be me, isn't it?" she demanded, though her voice had lost its familiar command. The others glanced away, not willing to answer. Elsewhere, at the playground, a group of fathers clustered by the fence, trading theories. It had been years since the neighborhood, always so composed and suburbanly sterile, had hosted anything approaching drama. The mothers, on the other hand, seemed to exist in a swirl of anxiety and outrage. Faces were redrawn by rumor. Friends became suspects, every offhand remark a clue. By Friday, the entire block was a live wire. Supermarket aisles echoed with shushed speculation. At the school's PTO meeting, awkward laughter rose and died as soon as someone uttered the blog. People were checking phone screens between sentences, some in silent fascination, others out of fear that their own names or habits would surface next. Screenshots from Queen Bee Watch began circulating outside Maplewood as well. One post, mocking the annual parent brunch with its ranking of top Tupperware presentation, surfaced on a local parenting forum. The commentary was blistering but entertaining. "You can tell the writer knows these people," wrote one reader. Another, less amused, posted, "This is exactly what's wrong with these gated communities." Outside readers, some sympathetic, some scornful, joined the fray. Maria recognized the sense of camaraderie in their applause and their anger. She had not anticipated how much her words would resonate or sting among strangers. With the blog's rising notoriety, the Maplewood air thickened with suspicion. Every woman, from the newly relocated interior designer to the PTA veteran with a decades-old address, began privately counting her own secrets and public transgressions. Conversations grew clipped. Invitations to lunches and yoga classes were no longer open-ended, but carefully, painfully monitored. A sense of paranoia seeped in. Was the new neighbor too friendly? Was the quiet mom in the back row of the book club feigning shyness while taking mental notes? Maria watched this cascade from a nervous distance. She noticed a new reserve even from people who had previously ignored her. Now, glances lingered half a second too long. Polite greetings came laced with an undertone of interrogation. Children's birthday parties, once open to the whole class, became invitation-only affairs. The Maplewood Moms private group chat, once a continuous hum of event reminders and Pinterest ideas, fractured into smaller cliques. Some mothers pledged fierce loyalty to Brenda and her original circle, determined to root out the traitor. Others quietly admitted, in one-on-one messages, that Queen Bee Watch struck close to home, that the blog's satire, while pointed, didn't invent its targets out of thin air. For some, the experience was mortifying. Maria caught glimpses of Jessica hurriedly deleting photos from her public profiles and heard, secondhand, about Caroline declining brunch invitations. Meanwhile, Brenda organized an emergency meeting for her closest confidants, a not-so-subtle ploy to sniff out the author by cross-referencing who was present at various detailed blog events. The detective work was amateurish but relentless. Yet not everyone in Maplewood was outraged. A few residents, especially those on the social margins themselves, felt vindicated by the blog's accuracy. An older retiree emailed the Queen Bee Watch tip line. "Thank you. It's about time someone showed these ladies what it feels like." Parents whose kids struggled to break into the in-crowd at school sent private messages of support, grateful that someone had finally voiced what they'd only dared whisper at bedtime. Sometimes perfection is nothing but a wall. Maria felt all this from her vantage point, never quite in the community, but suddenly at its feverish, secretive center. She was amazed at how quickly her words, a few late-night entries written out of pain and wit, had rattled the entire neighborhood. Yet she was not immune to fear. Every time her phone vibrated, her heart hammered, imagining the possibility of discovery. She obsessively cleared her computer cache and changed her passwords. She stopped herself from telling Javier how far things had spiraled, unwilling to see worry or disappointment flicker across his honest face. In her own small circle, backlash was immediate. At school pickup, a mother who had previously exchanged warm nods with Maria now offered only a thin, uncertain smile. The bakery clerk, usually chatty, became hurried and formal. It dawned on Maria that, anonymous or not, the neighborhood's boundaries and the wounds of its excluded were real and deepening. Yet for every cold shoulder, there was new solidarity. Strange faces nodded in sympathetic understanding. A Filipino mother, herself a target of microaggressions, squeezed Maria's hand without a word after Mass. An elderly neighbor, recognized as the one who walks with her head high no matter what, praised the courage of the chronicler, oblivious to Maria's growing guilt. The world outside Maplewood responded too. Local news blogs ran cryptic pieces about the expose-rocking and affluent suburb. Comments flooded in from people far beyond their town, some lambasting Maria for troublemaking, others expressing gratitude for finally exposing social stratification that simmered everywhere. But within Maria's home, the climate was quietly tense. Even Sophia seemed changed, quietly asking why some of her friends weren't talking to her at school anymore, and why Daddy sometimes sighed over breakfast, staring into his coffee as if searching for safe answers. At night, Maria lay awake, the glow of her phone the only source of comfort, her own words echoing back at her, sometimes as validation, sometimes as warning. She questioned whether she had gone too far, whether the blog was justice or vengeance, and wondered what might happen when, inevitably, curiosity gave way to accusation and the hunt for Queen Bee Watch reached her own doorstep. Still, she wrote on. The dam had burst. Maplewood Estates, for all its practiced perfection, could no longer deny the flaws in its reflection. For Maria, there was no return to invisibility. What remained now was to weather the storm her words had stirred, and to decide who she would become once the whispers gave way to confrontation. Parallel. Lives. By daylight, Maria Alvarez moved through Maplewood Estates as just another mother, one who packed lunches, shepherded children to playdates, and nodded politely at the ones who would hardly meet her eyes. She folded laundry in the sunlit dining room, hung up Sophia's backpack by the door, and pulled Mateo onto her lap to hush his afternoon fussing. Outsiders saw nothing but maternal warmth, resilience in the face of chilly exclusion, and the quiet persistence of a woman refusing to yield to homesickness or humiliation. Inside her own home, Maria was the constant, comforting, gentle, hopeful for her family even as she doubted her own belonging. Yet the moment the sun coasted over the rooftops and the neighborhood's children were hauled inside for dinner, Maria's world shifted. Where her days were full of effortful blending in, her nights brimmed with purpose and secrecy. When Javier finally settled into bed, oblivious to the cyclone that raged within her, Maria exhaled the day's anxieties and pulled out her battered blue notebook and her laptop. The familiar world of Queen Bee Watch, with its stinging satire, its vulnerable truths, was waiting. She could not remember when the split within her had first become so pronounced. Perhaps it was in the early weeks, when her greetings in the park were ignored and her daughter's smile faded under the weight of silent exclusion. Perhaps it was during Sophia's first tearful admission after school. "Mom, why don't they play with me?" Or when Maria herself was passed over for arranging the school bake sale, her confections deemed too ethnic for the PTA. Or maybe the division had always existed, slumbering and ready, brought into sharp relief only by Maplewood's performative perfection. Maria was well aware of the contradiction. "I live two lives," she scrawled in Spanish across a private notebook entry one night. By day, a shadow. By night, the voice that cuts through shadows. There was guilt, yes, but the power she felt, in the act of writing, in her clandestine rebellion, was undeniable. She built her days with extra care, determined that none of her family would suspect what flourished behind the soft click of her laptop at night. She played with Mateo in the backyard, teaching him words in both English and Spanish, offering him the childhood she had longed for, one unburdened by whispered judgments. She sat beside Sophia at the kitchen table, encouraging her to keep drawing, to stay bold, to resist shrinking in the face of unkindness. She kissed Javier gently, offering him optimism where doubts racked her heart, praising his every effort to make their transition smooth. But after dishes were scrubbed, lights were dimmed, and the steady, trusting breathing of her family echoed down the hallway, Maria was transformed. Under the glow of her desk lamp, Maria became incisive, almost fearless. She pored over her notebook, reliving the day's parade of microaggressions, petty cruelties, and rare drops of kindness. For each entry in Queen Bee Watch, she carefully constructed scenes. The latest neighborhood book club, where, disguised by witty dialogue, she revealed the subtle battles for approval. A community wellness talk, in which Brenda's circle performed concern for mental health while discreetly nursing rivalries. Maria wielded her words not just as weapons, but as spotlights, illuminating both the ugliness and the vulnerability beneath Maplewood's gleaming surface. The contradiction between her two selves gnawed at her. Sometimes she would pause mid-sentence, staring out the window at the arc of sodium-orange street lamps along Maple Lane, wondering if exposure would destroy her or set her free. She asked herself if the satisfaction of telling the truth was worth the risk to her family, to her integrity, even to her sense of self. Was she truly exposing injustice, or had pain mutated into something vengeful? There were nights when the weight became nearly unbearable. Maria would close her laptop and clutch it tightly to her chest, tears stinging as regret and pride jostled for dominance. In her mind, she replayed the cold stares in the school hallway, the hesitant glances of parents who once smiled but now wondered if she was watching, taking notes, making judgments. Could they ever understand what it was like to stand constantly on the outside, to be dissected for an odd accent, a child's skin tone, a lunch that smelled of home? Still, a part of her relished the influence she had gained, even if it was hidden. It was a strange kind of power, intoxicating and lonely. Sometimes, reading the anonymous messages sent to her tip line, notes of gratitude, or confessions about the wounds of Maplewood, Maria felt a shared ache. She was not the only one living two lives here. Many played roles, masking fragility with silk blouses, yoga routines, and unyielding smiles. Her relationship with Javier became subtly complicated. He remained supportive, throwing himself into work and family, never suspecting the nature of Maria's nightly work. She loved him for his steadiness, but sometimes resented his reluctance to see how cruel the world outside could be. Maria wondered how he would react if he knew. Would he be proud of her or ashamed? Would he understand that the blog was not simply a weapon, but her attempt to carve understanding and empathy from the marble of judgment? Then there were the constant reminders of the blog's risky doubleness. A slip of language at a school event sent her heart racing. A knowing look from a neighbor made her wonder if her mask had slipped. Yet she held fast. Maria rehearsed every school run, every grocery store trip, like an actress perfecting her lines for a high-stakes audition. Even as every day brought fresh whispers about the blog, its author, and the inevitable reckoning, she would not give herself away as Queen Bee Watch grew beyond its origins, taking on a life of its own and drawing attention from across the digital landscape. Maria's dual existence became more perilous. Rumors swirled about who was behind the words, about motives, about old secrets. Each night, posting her carefully composed observations, Maria braced herself for discovery, for backlash, for vindication. Privately, she ached for unity, that one day, who she was in daylight and darkness might merge, her voice no longer hidden, her family unafraid. Until then, she lived in the tension between two worlds, the ordinary routines of motherhood and the extraordinary reach of her secret descent. She knew her life on Maplewood's quiet avenues could never be simple again. But as she pressed publish on a new post, Maria understood something profound. Sometimes, in living parallel lives, we discover where our true self resides and where the hunger for justice refuses to be quieted. The unmasking. The tension was tangible in Maplewood Estates, stretching tighter each day as the hunt for the creator of Queen Bee Watch intensified. Suspicion hung over every interaction, twisting even the smallest gestures. A sideways glance at the PTA meeting, a half-finished sentence at the coffee shop, into a possible clue. For weeks, Maria watched the neighborhood retreat into a collective unease, her heart pounding a little harder each time she locked eyes with Brenda or Jessica in the school hallway. She consoled herself that her precautions, anonymous emails, a VPN, edited details, should keep her secret safe. But secrets, as Maria had chronicled so well, rarely remain contained behind even the sturdiest facades. It started subtly. After one particularly biting post about a block party gone awry, complete with tongue-in-cheek details only an attendee could know, Caroline's husband, Richard, a tech consultant with a penchant for cybersecurity, grew curious. Over dinner, he mentioned to Caroline, half-jokingly, that he'd noticed some digital breadcrumbs left by Queen Bee Watch. Caroline scoffed at first, but later that evening, when Brenda's group chat lit up with wild new theories about the blogger's identity, she asked Richard to take a look. Richard dove in, tracing site visits, hunting IP addresses, and cross-matching timestamps with group events. To most, this would have been harmless digital sleuthing. To the Maplewood Queen Bees, it was a crusade. Within a couple of days, he had narrowed the blog's login activity to a handful of local households, including the Alvarezes. Coupled with circumstantial evidence, the sharp uptick in Maria's visible note-taking, her presence at every described event, and a suspiciously precise schedule matching the blog's publication times, Richard felt certain. The next blog post was the clincher. Maria, wrung out from a week of terse small talk and icy stares, wrote a satirical account of a recent backyard yoga soiree. She changed names and minor details, but the core was too accurate, mentioning a neighbor's distinctive sun hat, the taste of Prosecco, a child's offhand comment that only a handful had heard. That night, after the post went live, screenshots ricocheted across Maplewood's group texts. Rumors reached a boil by morning. By midday, Maria noticed a peculiar stillness. At the school pickup line, whispering ceased when she approached. Smiles were brittle, eyes wary. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed toward Maria. She heard Brenda's unmistakable tennis shoe shuffle behind her. But when she turned, Brenda was deep in conversation. Her voice pitched just loud enough for Maria to catch. "Can you believe she would betray her own neighbors for a laugh?" Maria's phone buzzed with a notification. "Check your porch." Her stomach plummeted. Sitting atop the doormat was a pale pink envelope, her name in looping cursive. Inside was a single card, bordered in gold, which read simply, "You are cordially invited to discuss your recent writing with the ladies of Maplewood." Friday, 8 p.m. Brenda's house. The words burned. Maria sat at her kitchen table, the air humming with dread. She read the card over and over, her fingers trembling. She could feel the invisible net tightening. The invitation wasn't merely social. It was a summons. On Friday evening, as the sun dipped amber behind manicured hedges, Maria stood at her closet, feeling as though she were selecting armor for battle. She chose a simple navy dress, neither too bold nor apologetic, and tied her hair back the way she used to for job interviews back in LA, steeling herself. Javier, noticing her unease, asked what was wrong. Maria offered a half-truth. "A gathering with the neighborhood moms?" and kissed his forehead before letting herself out. The walk to Brenda's felt like a gauntlet. Laughter spilled from the backyard, filtered with tension. The moment Maria entered the foyer, all conversation stopped. Brenda stood at the center of the living room, flanked by Jessica and Caroline. A tight circle of women ringed the room, arms crossed or clenching wine glasses, faces expectant and charged. Brenda's smile was as brittle as spun sugar. "We know, Maria," she said, voice calm and deliberate. "You're the one behind Queen Bee Watch." The accusation landed with a physical force. Maria's cheeks blazed, and her first impulse was denial. Yet she could feel the futility. It was all there. The evidence, the conviction in their eyes. Caroline stepped forward, a note of sadness in her gaze. "Why, Maria? Why would you do this to us?" A dozen voices broke in, some angry, some wounded, others just curious or in awe. "We trusted you, let you into our homes. You made us look like monsters. Do you have any idea what you've done to our reputation, to our children?" Maria felt her throat tighten. She closed her eyes for a moment, drawing a deep breath, summoning the resolve she'd only ever known in the privacy of her late-night writing. The same hands that had trembled with guilt over her keyboard now steadied at her sides. She stepped forward and spoke, her voice trembling but unwavering. "You're right. I wrote the blog, but I didn't do it for laughs or to make anyone look bad. I did it because I felt invisible here, because every day my children and I were made to feel other, because there is so much pain under the perfection in this neighborhood, and no one talks about it unless they can hide behind sarcasm and gossip. I thought if I told the truth, yes, through a little bit of satire, it might finally be seen." A heavy silence fell. Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. Jessica looked away, mind racing for a retort. From the corner, a softer voice spoke. "But did it have to be so public, Maria? Couldn't you have just come to us?" Maria looked around at the assembled women, remembering every forced smile, every barely concealed slight. "When?" she asked quietly. "Was it when you laughed at my accent? Or when no one answered my hellos at the park? When you assumed my family was here illegally? That my daughter's lunch was weird? I tried. The whole time, I tried. A ripple of discomfort broke the circle's composure. Several women shifted, unable to meet Maria's gaze. Brenda broke the silence. We want you to apologize and take the blog down. Today. Otherwise, we'll make sure the rest of Maplewood and the school know exactly what you've done. The threat lingered in the air, unspoken consequences stretching far beyond a blog. Maria wavered, the weight of everything she risked settling on her like a shroud. Yet something inside her refused to shrink away. She met Brenda's glare with quiet steel. I'll think about your request, but I won't apologize for telling the truth. As she turned to leave, Caroline's voice followed, softer. I wish you'd felt like you could trust us. Maria paused, glancing back. I wish I could have too. The door shut behind her, sealing away the judgment, the expectations, the old order of Maplewood Estates. Outside, night had settled, quiet, uncertain, heavy with the promise of change. Maria walked home under a sky throbbing with hidden stars, marveling at both the terror and the relief that accompanied her unmasking. There would be fallout, she knew, repercussions for her family, storms yet to weather. But as she stepped over her threshold, she realized she had been seen, heard, and for the first time in Maplewood had spoken as herself, maskless and unafraid. Confrontation and fallout. The hours and days after Maria's unmasking passed in a fever of rumors, secondhand stories, and fraught reckonings. Maplewood Estates trembled as if struck by a silent earthquake, its polite veneer shaken loose to reveal fault, lines that had always run just beneath the surface. For Maria, the aftermath was both quieter and lonelier than she had anticipated. The morning after the fateful meeting at Brenda's, she woke early, her heart pounding at any unfamiliar sound. She watched Javier spoon cereal for Sophia and joke lightly with Mateo, as if nothing had changed. But Maria's mind reeled with what might come next. She tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself nothing truly dangerous had happened, yet. But as she walked Sophia to school, bracing herself for the gauntlet of Maplewood's morning drop-off ritual, the mood in the crowd had shifted palpably. Conversations among the mothers ceased when she approached. People who had once offered clipped greetings now stared straight ahead as Maria passed. Some glanced up and dropped their eyes. Others gave her tight, unreadable smiles that left her colder than outright hostility ever could. What surprised Maria most, however, was not the coldness itself. It was that the chill wasn't universal. A few parents, those rarely at the sizzle of the social center, whispered encouragement as she passed. One father, waiting for his son, caught her eye and nodded, his look weighted with gratitude. I'm glad someone said something, he murmured under his breath. Others simply offered soft smiles that, for the first time since her arrival, felt genuine. Yet the positive responses were overwhelmed by the pettier brand of condemnation. Within 24 hours, word had spread to the school administration. Maria received a polite but uncomfortable email requesting a meeting to discuss respectful participation in the school community. Anonymous emails arrived in her inbox, some scathing, others pleading for her to stop, a handful thanking her for her courage. On Maplewood's private social network, the blog and Maria herself became subjects of feverish debate. Screenshots surfaced, dissected, and vented upon by distant acquaintances and strangers alike. At home, the tension bled into ordinary routines. Sophia grew sullen, asking why her friends seemed to avoid her. why one of the neighborhood girls had returned her birthday invitation with only a sticker and no reply. Maria tried to explain gently, choosing words meant to preserve her child's faith and kindness. People are sometimes scared of change, mija, but being brave can feel lonely at first. Even Mateo, too young to grasp the social dynamics, sensed the strain, clinging to Maria's legs and growing shy at the playground. For the Maplewood mothers, the reckoning began in fits and starts. Some, like Brenda, clung to outrage. She launched a campaign in the community's group chats to hold Maria accountable, painting her as a traitor who had undermined the trust of Maplewood. She suggested that Maria's children might not benefit from after-school activities and pressured others to uninvite the Alvarezes from upcoming events. Jessica, initially defensive and wounded, posted a lengthy message online without naming Maria directly, contemplating forgiveness, then pivoting to indignation. "Isn't community about loyalty and support?" she wrote. "Haven't we welcomed every family who tries to fit in?" The comments section told another story, some echoing Jessica's sentiments, others quipping that perhaps welcoming was not, in fact, inclusive for everyone. Caroline, however, couldn't settle into a single emotion. She sat alone with her cup of coffee, rereading the passage in Queen Bee Watch that had outed her own vulnerability. Instead of anger, she felt an unexpected kinship, a recognition that the mask she wore was suffocating even her friendships. She left Maria a note in her mailbox, plain, unsigned, and simple. As fallout widened, the neighborhood's strict borders began to blur. Mothers argued at the bakery over whose side to take. Book club meetings dissolved before the first glass of Chardonnay could be poured. The yoga group, once a sanctum of unity, fractured into email threads debating whether to boycott or embrace the conversation Maria had started. Local media, already curious about Maplewood's blogger drama, reached out for comment, stirring the tension further. A journalist offered Maria a chance to speak anonymously on record. She declined, not wanting to feed the flames or further endanger her family. Javier became increasingly concerned, noticing harsh whispers at the grocery store and a sudden drop in client calls for his contracting business. One night after dinner, he confronted Maria gently but seriously. "Cariño, was it worth it? I support you, but we can't be at war with an entire town." Maria met his gaze, understanding the exhaustion in his eyes, but she shook her head. "If I apologize, will they suddenly see us? Or will they just shut me up?" The Alvarez's isolation became a new normal. Invitations dwindled. Children's playdates were ruled not a good idea right now. Yet there was resilience, too, woven into their evenings, a renewed closeness among the family, small comforts shared over milky tea, shared jokes, shared burdens. The most profound changes, however, rippled through the larger community. A handful of mothers approached Maria in quiet spaces, store aisles, parking lots, back pews at church, to thank her. "You described my life too," whispered one mother of 3, eyes wet. Another simply squeezed Maria's arm, unable to find words but offering solidarity in a gesture. Meanwhile, social media outside Maplewood burst with debate. Messages came in from across the country, from other mothers, immigrant families, young women charting their own paths in unfriendly places, all echoing relief at seeing someone speak up. The blog had become more than Maplewood's drama. It was a crack in the myth of perfection, and the echo was resounding. As the days rolled forward, Maria found both courage and exhaustion at the center of this storm. She wondered if the community would heal, or if it would split forever along the lines she had accidentally exposed. She worried for her children's innocence, her family's peace, her own ability to reclaim what privacy she had left. Yet through the hardship, Maria recognized a truth. There was no path backward, no way to unspeak what so many had longed to voice. On a quiet morning, as she watched the street from her window. Maria realized she had catalyzed change, both destructive and just possibly redemptive. The neighborhood would never be the same, but neither would she. The woman who had arrived fearful and uncertain was gone, replaced by one who had found her voice and, in confronting Maplewood, had finally begun to believe in the worth of her own story. Aftermath and storms. In the days that followed Maria's unmasking, waves of repercussions battered her from all sides. The revelation that one of their own, an outsider at that, had chronicled Maplewood's secrets for the world to see rocked the community far beyond its manicured hedges. Where the initial shock had left neighbors silent and wary, soon a storm of responses swept through every facet of Maria's life. She could sense it before she saw it, the subtle emptying of sidewalks when she stepped outside, the way parents altered school drop-off routines to avoid her gaze, the lowered voices that fell to an uneasy hush as she crossed the supermarket parking lot with her children. At church, the pastor paused mid-sermon to say a prayer for those facing community unrest, his eyes flicking briefly in her direction. Maria's family had never been so visible, or so alone. Javier felt the strain right away. Jobs dried up inexplicably. Contractors who once sought partnership now replied to his bids with polite, non-committal excuses. His jokes grew rarer, and Maria saw exhaustion in the lines under his eyes. He tried to shield her from his worry, but each evening, long after they put Sofia and Mateo to bed, she could sense him wrestling with doubts about their future in Maplewood. Even the children were not spared. Sofia came home teary-eyed, clutching her uneaten lunch, telling Maria that her name had been skipped during reading circle. Mateo's preschool teacher avoided conversation, eyes flitting nervously as she handed off the toddler at pickup. Maria's heart ached as she realized that even the youngest members of her family bore the weight of adult resentments. Meanwhile, inside the invisible walls of Maplewood, a frenzy grew. Group chats exploded with speculation, accusation, and a scattering of attempted reconciliations. Brenda and her loyalists doubled down, hosting exclusive support circles that felt more like damage control meetings. "We must protect our families," Brenda declared, sending a round of texts that skillfully suggested that embracing Maria, or even speaking with her, meant condoning betrayal. But fissures formed in the so-called United Front. A smaller group of mothers, quietly emboldened by Maria's truth-telling, began questioning the code of silence that had always defined Maplewood. In backyards, over cups of coffee, or while pushing strollers around the neighborhood pond, whispers began to turn into cautious, public statements. "Maybe it's time to talk about how we treat people who don't fit in." With every such confession, the once monolithic neighborhood crowd splintered a little more. Beyond Maplewood, the Queen Bee Watch saga took on a new life. Once local news caught wind, a parade of headlines followed. Maria's blog readership skyrocketed. Comments poured in from across the country and beyond. Immigrant mothers in Denver, single dads in Minneapolis, even retirees in gated communities in Florida wrote to say they recognized themselves in Maria's isolation and pain. Some sent supportive messages. Others confided that they, too, were struggling in places that prized uniformity over acceptance. The supportive tide, though, ran parallel to a virulent backlash. Anonymous emails lacked all restraint. "How dare you air dirty laundry and make us all look bad? Why not just leave if you hate us so much?" Rumors floated that the Alvarezes were planning to sue the school, or might be forced out by the HOA. Maria ignored most of it, clinging to her family and a handful of true friends, but the attacks took their toll. Sleep evaded her, replaced by brittle, anxious energy and a gnawing uncertainty about what would come next. Inside their home, Maria strove to create a shield of calm. She read extra stories to the children at night, baked pan dulce on weekends, and began teaching Sofia simple phrases in Spanish. a reclaiming of their roots, a gentle rebellion against the pressure to assimilate at all costs. She tried to comfort Javier, even as she struggled with her own doubts. They spoke late into the night, weighing whether to leave Maplewood or try to weather the storm now that the mask was off. One late afternoon, Caroline appeared on Maria's doorstep. Her face was puffy from crying, her posture vulnerable, stripped of pretense. "I'm sorry," Caroline whispered. "I should have stood up for you. Half of us have felt the same, but we were scared to be next." Her voice trembled as she offered a hug, not the social gesture of busy mornings, but the honest, grateful embrace of someone who had seen the cost of silence firsthand. Those moments of honesty multiplied, slowly and quietly. Other families who'd kept their distance now sent short texts or notes. One father left chocolates on their porch with a message that read simply, "Thank you for saying what no one else could." An elderly Vietnamese neighbor brought flowers and bowed gently in acknowledgement. Maria's world, so recently shrunken, began to expand in unpredictable, fragile ways. Within the wider community, the blog spurred hard conversations about diversity, privilege, and what genuine belonging could look like. The school's PTA set up listening circles. The local paper ran editorials urging readers to bridge differences, not reinforce them. Maplewood's illusion of seamless perfection was permanently broken, but in its place, small seeds of understanding were newly sown. Yet, Maria remained realistic. True change would not be immediate or universally welcomed. Some bonds, so easily broken, would not be restored. Some wounds, so deeply felt, would take long to heal. Each outing remained a trial, each day a lesson in courage. Still, in the middle of the storm, she found her own resolve steelier than ever. As fall turned toward winter, Maria sat at her kitchen table, a fresh entry open on the Queen Bee Watch blog. She no longer wrote only of pain and exclusion. Now she chronicled acts of kindness, the faces of quiet solidarity, and the hope glimmering in neighbors relearning how to see each other. She knew the storm had changed them all, herself most of all. But she wrote with a new kind of faith, that speaking the truth was always the first step toward belonging, for herself and for all the outsiders waiting to be heard. New recognition. With the last leaves of autumn layered in golden piles along the curbs of Maplewood estates, the fever of scandal finally began to break. In the weeks that followed, Maria's unmasking and the storm that raged through her life and the community, a wary sort of calm settled on the once pristine neighborhood. It was not the smug tranquility of old, but something more honest, fragile and unfinished, yet real. For Maria, the first signs of change came quietly. She noticed them in small, almost unnoticeable gestures. The way a neighbor paused a moment longer to hold open the supermarket door. The softer tone in Mrs. Peterson's greeting at Sunday Mass. The tentative, grateful smile from a father at the playground, whose children had never been included in the right cliques until recently. The air of suspicion lingered, but so did empathy, and now a sense of indebtedness from those who had never had the courage to speak. Maria herself had been transformed. The old anxiety, the constant calculation of how to blend in, how not to offend, had faded. She took to wearing her favorite embroidered blouse from Mexico one morning, despite knowing it stood out among the sea of down jackets and muted pastels. She packed Sophia's lunch with extra servings of pan dulce and watched with quiet pride as her daughters shared them fearlessly. No one at school said anything. In the stillness that replaced the gossip, Maria found the dignity she'd been seeking since she set foot in Maplewood. One afternoon, a mother who used to avoid Maria at every turn approached her at the library. She surprised both of them by apologizing, awkwardly and without pretense, for her own part in the wall of silence and exclusion. She confessed that reading Maria's blog entries, however painful, had helped her see both her complicity and her opportunities to be kinder. "We just didn't know how to change," the woman finished, "until you made it impossible not to look." As these conversations multiplied, so too did the local chorus of support. Members of the PTA, once resistant, reached out to Maria, asking if she would help them organize a multicultural food fair for the spring. "We have a lot to learn," the new PTA president admitted. "We want everybody's story to be on the table, literally and figuratively." It was the first truly inclusive event Maria had experienced since moving to Maplewood. Change filtered into the school as well. Teachers, once wary, made space for conversations about family heritage, respect, and difference. Sophia, who had once dreaded recess, found herself invited to new games. Her accent and background transformed from points of ridicule into sparks for curiosity and even admiration. It wasn't only Maria who benefited. The blog had set in motion a kind of chain reaction. Other parents, once confined to the edges of Maplewood's social life, began forming their own networks of support. Book clubs introduced novels by writers from immigrant backgrounds. Neighbors swapped stories about their personal struggles and, slowly, sometimes awkwardly, began to replace performance with authenticity. Maria kept the Queen Bee Watch blog alive, but reimagined its purpose. No longer an outlet for only satire and resistance, it evolved into a space where stories of empathy, courage, and cultural richness could take center stage. She wrote about the Vietnamese grandmother's garden that supplied herbs for more than half the block, the Nigerian dad's impromptu soccer lessons in the park, the silent grace of shy children finding their voices in the school talent show. The change reached further than anyone expected. Local media circled back, not with sensational headlines, but with coverage of Maplewood's journey, highlighting the blog's role in building bridges and healing rifts. Maria was hesitant about the attention, but determined to make it count. When a journalist asked her what she hoped for next, she replied simply, "Understanding, and a place for everyone at the table." Javier, too, found new confidence. After weathering cold shoulders and lost business, he noticed old clients trickling back, some expressing quiet apologies, and others merely returning as if nothing had happened. On weekends, he joined community service projects, sharing jokes and tamales with parents he once doubted he'd ever know. The Alvarez household, once anxious and insular, became known for its warmth and for the unmistakable scent of Maria's baking, wafting through an open door. The biggest transformation was reserved for Maria's sense of self. Each night, as she pulled out the battered notebook that started it all, she was struck by how far she and Maplewood had come. She understood at last that she had not broken the neighborhood. She had remade it, not by tearing it apart, but by insisting it grow wider, richer, more real. Letters arrived from beyond their zip code, emails from strangers who saw themselves in Maria's story. High schoolers in distant towns sent thanks, telling her they had printed out blog excerpts to read aloud in classrooms where they felt out of place. Retirees wrote about learning to make new friends despite lifelong habits of sameness. And other mothers sent pictures of their children's festivals, proud of traditions long kept quiet. Of course, there were some in Maplewood who would never forgive the disruption, who saw Maria only as the one who shattered an illusion they preferred. But even these voices lost their sting. Maria had learned to see them with pity, no longer pain, recognizing that their refusal to change came from fear more than loathing. As the year drew to a close, the block threw a holiday potluck. Maria brought a tray of sweet tamales, letting Sophia and Mateo carry them with pride. At the long, crowded table under strings of borrowed lights, Maria was no longer at the edges. She was at the center, not as an intruder, but as a neighbor. She laughed when one of the longtime Maplewood moms asked for her recipe. She listened, too, as newcomers recounted their own stories of loneliness and hope. The moment was not perfect, but it was true, and Maria cherished its imperfection. That night, as she closed her eyes beside Javier, Maria felt peace, real peace, earned by the storms she'd weathered and the honesty she'd insisted upon. She knew Maplewood would never be a storybook community, and that neither she nor her family would ever be invisible again. That, she decided, was the greatest recognition of all. And in the warm hum of their house, a home at last, Maria picked up her pen once more, ready to write the next chapter. For herself, her children, and countless others still seeking the courage to be seen.